Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 7 negotiations. This is the cognitive aspect of negotiations materials from the business professor. And so, what I thought we would do is walk through these, and I'm not going to reread the material back to you. You can read it for yourself. But what I thought I would do is offer some thoughts and some ideas, and then trigger some questions that we could use in the forums. So these are the topics that we'll go through. And again, you may want to follow along with the business professor materials directly, but also please make sure to participate in the forums regarding these materials. Okay, so the first one is perception. And what I like, I guess what I should say is by way of introduction for this chapter is this chapter really deals with the psychology of negotiation, which I find to be very interesting. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not trained in psychology, but some of these concepts I find to be fascinating. And what you'll notice with this material is we're talking very rarely about the actual substance of the negotiation, and we are instead talking about the psychological, both perception, the feeling of it. That has a lot to do with the success of a negotiation, separate and apart from the actual substance of, well, who deserves how much. This is how we perceive it and process it mentally. So I find this to be really interesting material. Okay, so first is perception. So how do we, and I'm going to actually move myself up here so I don't, there we go. So how do we perceive our environment? So our perception is biased and distorted and based on our own experience. And so what we perceive is not necessarily what the counterparty we're working with perceives. And understanding how your perception distorts your view of the negotiation is very important. So we have perceptual distortion involves where our own myopic view of the world distorts how we perceive the other party. Because remember that when we're sitting across the table and reacting to something, what we're seeing, hearing, and is being processed by our brain. So it goes into our brain, and our brain often distorts that signal. So that's what we mean by perceptual distortion. And being aware and conscious of that can be a helpful tool. Now, stereotyping, we all know what that is. In the negotiation context, you make assumptions about your counterparty based on the class that they're from, whatever class it is from, whatever group they're part of. This can be racial, it can be gender-based, it could be socioeconomic, it could be cultural. So this is a very common problem in any interaction, but it plays a big role in negotiations because it has to do with how you're interacting with your counterparty. The halo effect is something I find to be very interesting. I came across this in another context recently, but the idea behind the halo effect is that you assume other characteristics based on one characteristic. So good-looking people are often perceived as being smarter, as that would be an example of this. And this video, by the way, I'm not going to play the whole thing, but when I post these slides, you can look at this video, and they do this little social experiment where they have two women in a train station in England, and they are trying to get their suitcases up the escalator, and big suitcases that they are struggling to handle, and they time how long it takes for someone to come help them. And in the one case, the female who is perceived or considered to be better looking, and that's just their thing, this is not me saying this, it's them, gets helped much faster. And it's really interesting to see. So I would check that out. The other context where this came up recently, that where when I was reading through this, I was like, oh, that's funny, I just read this in another book, has to do with Bernie Madoff. And if you're not familiar with Bernie Madoff, he was one of the biggest Ponzi schemers in the history of the world. And the way that he was able to perpetuate the scheme, it went on for decades, was because he was so well thought of and had such a great reputation that even in spite of evidence showing that he was a crook, people even like the SEC didn't believe it because they thought, well, how could the chairman of the NASDAQ be committing a Ponzi scheme? Well, that's because of this halo effect. They just assumed that because of who he was, that there's no possible way he could be perpetrating this kind of fraud. And you see that in fraud cases all the time. This is why the fraud, often people who get convicted of fraud are these people that the people around them said, I can't believe that it was him, right? I can't believe this person did this. Well, that's the halo effect. Selective perception, this is where you you get all of these inputs and you choose those that support an existing belief. This is very similar to a confirmation bias. So you tend to only see the evidence that you want to see and ignore the evidence that contradicts your pre-existing belief. And then projection is kind of a version of halo effect and stereotyping where you project characteristics onto someone else. But in this case, you do it based on your own characteristics. So if you have a characteristic, you project that on to your counterparty as if they have it, rather than potentially seeing that they might be different. So these are all different ways that we perceive the world that can affect a negotiation. Okay. All right, so cognitive framing, and you see I have a frame here. So I looked up found a frame because it's called framing. So I thought that was funny. Framing has to do with how you structure your thinking about a situation. And so in the book, they suggest that this could be, you could frame a situation as by interest, by rights, or by power. And those are kind of three main frames. And then it suggests these other characteristics of framing. They could be based on substance, the substance of the negotiation. They could be based on the outcome. They could be based on your aspiration for what you want. So there are these different examples here, which I will let you read about separately. But the question I have, and you'll notice over here, I made this little box with this little question icon. Here's questions for you in the forum. So how do you feel is your cognitive frame, maybe in one of the two negotiations we've done so far, where how did you frame the situation? Did you frame it as based on interest, rights, or power, or on one of these other characteristics? And then what frame was the other side using? And this is very important to sort of think through, well, how am I processing this situation and how might my counterparty be processing it? Because that will often lead to conflict or inability to come to an agreement. And so how else might you be able to use information about framing when you're negotiating with somebody? So if you think about this metaphor of a frame, you only see what is in you only see what's in the rectangle of this frame, right? So you don't see what's outside of it. And so by framing in one of these areas, it limits your vision. And that could be helpful, but it could also be it could also be limiting. So I'd like your thoughts about that in the forum. Okay, mental models. So mental models are a little bit different than a frame, although they're similar in some ways. So a frame is how you receive and process information, what you see through the little square. The mental model is how you approach a situation, what you do. One of them, and many of these have to do with personality traits. So and philosophies, personal philosophy. So a cost benefit analysis is something that's going to be very logic based, very utilitarian. How do we do the most good for the most number of people? The game playing model is one, and negotiating against somebody who is a game player is frustrating sometimes because they're just interested in outmaneuvering or winning some part of the game, as opposed to actually doing what's best for everybody. So they're motivated not by what's the best outcome, but by can they convince themselves that they've won up the other side. And in my experience, this game playing model dominates in a lot of business negotiations and results in agreements that are not always best for shareholders. Partnership model, I mentioned this in the last video, but if you have this model of developing long-term relationships, then you're going to be much more collaborative in your negotiation because you're worried about not only this negotiation, but the next one. So think about the $2 game that we did. And when we did it the last time, you had to negotiate a second time with the same person, how that might have been different if you knew that you were going to be negotiating with this person 2 times in a row. Would you take a different approach? So the partnership model is one that leads to a more kind of longer term collaborative process. And then problem solving, again, is kind of like in a way similar to cost benefit because it's logic based, but it has to do more with how do we solve the problem? How do we come to a conclusion? And that solving the problem is the overarching concern as opposed to winning or creating long-term relationships or doing the best for everyone. It's coming to a solution. So this would be one that would be collaborative, but also accommodative because it would mean that you're trying to get to a solution. So again, with respect to questions, which model did you use? Which model do you feel is most appropriate in which situation? What happens when someone else on the other side uses a different model? How might that cause conflict? And maybe what was your experience in the first 2 negotiations with respect to mental models? So please feel free to, if you have a thought on that, post your thoughts to the forum for this week for this. Okay. All right. Cognitive biases. These I'm not going to go through all the different ways that we can be biased, but we can be biased in many different ways. We have our brains are actually programmed to be biased. And there's all these different examples of ways that bias can affect your perceptions. So think through which of these biases that are described in the business professor chapter, which might apply to you. I was laughing this morning when I was telling my wife about this, and I read to her the definition of overconfidence and egocentrism, and she suggested that maybe she should do this part of the lecture because she thinks that I'm that way. So think about how others perceive you. Do they perceive you as having these biases? And if so, how does that impact your ability to negotiate? So have you experienced these so far in the first 2 negotiations? Which one do you think may apply to you? This is somewhat self-reflective, so if you're not comfortable answering the first question in the forums, I certainly understand that, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on cognitive bias and the relationship to the negotiation game that you've been playing so far. Okay, risk and risk perception. Now, this is interesting because there's all kinds of risks associated with any transaction. And you always have to think, there's this cliche that the market is either governed by greed or risk. And when it's either in a greed mode or a risk mode. And when you're in a risk mode, you're worried about possible negative outcomes or undesirable outcomes, as they say in the text. So there's all these different kinds of risk that you have to worry about when you're doing a transaction. And it's not just risk that you might get sued, for example, but there could be all these other downsides to the outcome. And so if you're too focused on risk, it sometimes makes it very hard to reach agreement. But at the same time, if you ignore risk, or if you take actions that are too risky, then it's possible that you could end up harming your shareholders. So you have to be careful about these. So when you look at the game that you've been playing so far, which ones of these risks have concerned you the most, and how did that impact the outcome of your negotiation, do you think? And which ones of these do you think have not been applicable? Because there's a couple on this list that have not been part of our game so far. And which ones are those and why? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Another, we used to call also the failure to reach an agreement. That's just not on this list, but just to give you an example, in our game that we're playing, if you fail to reach agreement, so far you've had a BATNA. You've had an agreement in place that you had in case you didn't reach agreement. Sometimes you don't have that. And even if you do, you have sometimes what's called a transaction risk. That's what we used to refer to it in the trade. And that means the risk of the transaction not going through, of failing in some way. And so you have to think also about what are the consequences of failure to reach agreement. Okay. Perceptions of entitlement and fairness. So this one, I heard a lot of chatter as I listened to you negotiate. But what's important here is this concept of fairness. What is fair? And what's fair to one person is not always fair to someone else. So you have to dive a little deeper to understand what you mean by fairness. So procedural fairness is, is the process itself fair? Is the process by which you are negotiating fair? If one party is, for example, maybe not participating in the process, or is being a bully in the negotiations and not listening to the other side and being unreasonably demanding and all of that, that is what you would refer to as procedural fairness. And then substantive fairness is the deal itself fair? So can we say that the deal itself is fair? And sometimes fairness can be a measure of equality. Does everyone get the equal outcome? It could be equity-based, which is relative to what you've put in, or it could be needs-based, which would mean, is it fair? Does the party that needs the outcome, do they get the outcome that they want? So fairness can come from each of these different perspectives. So I'm interested in particular in this, and what does fairness mean to you, and how does your difference in your perception of fairness, how has that been, how have you seen that in the negotiations? So I've told a story before. I'm not sure if I told it to you, so I'll tell it quickly. But it was when I had to tell the CEO of my company no. There was a law that prevented him from doing what he wanted to do. And his argument to me was that my answer couldn't possibly be right because, as he said it, the law has to be fair. Well, fair to whom? He saw the rule that prevented him from issuing this press release that he wanted to as being unfair, because it unfairly limited his ability to make this argument to the market that our company was strong and healthy financially and all this. But there was a reason for the rule. The rule was there to protect against companies who were trying to sell shares before the stock was registered. So the SEC would say that the rule creates a fairer market, but my CEO said he thought the rule was unfair. So this is where you have to think about what is the perception of entitlement and fairness. How is that perceived? Because that's different from one person to another. So I'm interested in your thoughts on this. Okay, social comparison. This is where your social standing with respect to your counterparty is taken into account. And so a negotiation is very different between a superior and a subordinate than it is between equals. And so the text argues that in a superior and a subordinate negotiation, it's more of a needs-based model, whereas if you're equal, it's more of an equity-based model. And I'll let you read that in the text and let me know if you agree with that. But the text also suggests that there are three ways that someone in the superior position could three tactics that they could use to reduce the disparity between the superior and the subordinate. So one of them is to change the inputs, one of them is to change the outcomes, and the other one is to alter the cognitive distortion that we talked about at the beginning. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that. How did it feel in particular in the negotiations when, if you felt that the power relationship between the two parties was unequal? Now, it'll also be interesting to find out if you felt it was unequal. Mathematically, it was equal so far in the two negotiations, but I know that it probably felt like it wasn't, and that's by design. So if you felt that way, then why did you feel it was that way, and how did it affect the negotiation itself and possibly the outcome? So I'm interested in your thoughts on that in the forum. Okay, mood and emotions. Won't spend a lot of time on this. I think this is fairly obvious. When you have a good outcome that you feel good about, you tend to feel happy about it. It feels, when you have positive consequences, when there's a bad outcome, you don't feel necessarily good about it. What's interesting about the negative emotions is you can actually have a good agreement but still feel bad about it. And that's often when you have procedural unfairness. So you might be able to come out of the negotiation with what you want, but you might think, I never want to talk to that person again. So you could have very negative emotions associated with even a positive outcome. So how did it feel when you were negotiating to get a good outcome? Did it feel positive? And if it didn't, why not? And if you failed to reach an agreement, how did that feel? Did that feel positive, negative? How did that make you feel about your negotiating party, about your efforts, and about the game itself? I'm interested in what your perceptions have been on this as you have gone through the game. Okay, I am not going to go through all of these. This is the longest section of the unit, but it says that there are all these tactics, these creative tactics that you can use to resolve conflicts at the heart of the negotiation. Creative approaches, creative tactics, and threats to a good negotiation. So read through these and let me know what your thoughts are on these as tactics. How might you have used them? How could you use them? What's something that you found interesting? How might your negotiations that you've done so far been different if you would have applied some of this? Hopefully what you're seeing up to this point is that the game, as we're playing it and as we go through the business professor materials, you should start to see some of the things that you read about in the business professor materialize in the negotiations themselves. And it's really important for the learning outcomes here, especially since we don't have time in class to talk about it anymore and we have to do it this way. It's really interesting. It's really important and interesting for me to see how you're processing the information. So participation in the forum is really important here. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how the negotiations have gone using some of these frameworks that are in the business professor materials from this week. So participation in the forums is mandatory. You don't have to answer every single one of the questions I pose to you, but I would expect that you are going to be an active participant in the forums this week and for the rest of the class, because let's face it, we're probably going to be doing this through the end of the semester, at the very least through the end of April. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts or anything else that I can do to help you, please let me know. And otherwise, I hope that you have a good spring break, a few days off, and use that time hopefully productively, maybe read ahead a little bit. And then I will be I'm going to use the spring break to structure the class for the second half of the semester. So I'll probably be recording more of these going forward. So use this as a maybe just a jumping off point for your thoughts, and hopefully we have a really good and active discussion in the forums. Thanks, stay safe and healthy, and we'll see you by video in week 8 after spring break. Thanks.